Well, welcome everybody to the Blunt Mansion. I'm Chris Magra. I'm a professor of history at the University of Tennessee, and I'm on the board here at the Blunt Mansion. Very proud to be a board member here. We are blessed in Knoxville with a lot of local history, whether it's the East Tennessee History Center, the Knoxville History Project, the James White Fort, Harble Springs, on, Sycamore Shoals are right here at Blunt Mansion. We're blessed with a lot of local history, and our board and the staff here at the Blunt Mansion is proud to preserve that history, proud to make sure that our next generations don't forget that William Blunt was the founding father. The headquarters for the Southwest Territory was right here in Knoxville, and there's so much rich history. And I kind of wanted to connect that local history of the place where we all live, to the Declaration of Independence. Now, can anybody guess why I want to talk about the Declaration of Independence? Why I'm fired up to talk about the Declaration of Independence? Yeah, what? You have a guess about that?
250 years.
We're coming up on a pretty big one. 250-year anniversary is pretty big. It doesn't come on very often, and we all are fortunate that we're here for it. We can tell our kids and our grandkids about the 250th anniversary. How about that? The signing of the Declaration of Independence. There's going to be a lot of events. There's events going on this year and next year. And I wanted to kick things off and talk to you all about how the place where you all live was connected to the Declaration of Independence. It shouldn't surprise any of you in this room to know that Knoxville in this area is part of the Westward expansion. It shouldn't surprise anybody in this room. You all turned out on a Saturday afternoon, a beautiful Saturday afternoon, for a history talk. So I'm assuming you all love history just as much as I do. It shouldn't surprise you that this area is linked to the Westward expansion as a frontier in the colonial era. But it should surprise some of you that this area is linked to the Declaration of Independence. When you think about the Declaration, your mind goes to places like Philadelphia and the Continental Congress, and you think of wealthy founding fathers in their powdered wigs sitting around sweltering, putting together the Declaration of Independence. Our mind doesn't go to places like Knoxville, but it should. It should, because this area was on the minds of Thomas Jefferson and the other members of the five-man committee assembled to put together the Declaration of Independence, and was on the minds of the members at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They're thinking about what's going on in places like the area that we live on. And we're thinking about the concerns that people have living in this area. And they're thinking about how to express those concerns in the Declaration, one of our founding documents. This area that we live in right now is connected to this foundational document. I think that's amazing. It's connected in multiple ways, and I'm going to talk to you all about 3 of those ways today. Dave and Rose were kind enough to say I could talk as long as I like. So we could be here for a couple hours. It's nice and air conditioned in here, so I think that's all right. Well, thank you all for coming out. I appreciate you being here. And like I said, this history is important, and it's our history.
The map you had up there, what date is that?
This is a map showing the original colonial charters, which is why those borders extend so far to the west. In fact, Virginia's original charter included a lot of the continent of North America.
But the date. The date.
Oh, this is just a. It's not a particular map, ma'am, that was made at a certain date. It's a representation of these colonial charters, and how, just showing you. I wanted to include it, ma'am. I thought it was helpful for you all to see when we're talking about the frontier, the fact that a lot of Virginians and North Carolina settlers are coming into this area. And it kind of helps to wrap your mind around it to think about North Carolina having a claim to this area. Same with Virginia. Smoke on the mountains, right? In the wild, untamed folds of the Appalachian frontier, where the mist clung to the ridges like a shroud of mystery, John Sevier emerged as a fiery spirit of independence and grit. The Watauga settlement, nestled along the banks of the Watauga River, in what is now eastern Tennessee, was more than just a cluster of cabins. It was a bold experiment in self-governance, forged by settlers who dared to live beyond the breach of British colonial rule. Sevier, with his keen mind and fearless heart, became a natural leader among these pioneers, helping to shape the Watauga Association, one of the first autonomous governments in the American colonies. As tensions with the British Crown simmered into revolution, the frontier echoed with the same cry for liberty that rang through Boston and Philadelphia. Here in the shadow of the Smokies, the seeds of American independence took root in soil watered by hardship, courage, and a dream of a new world where freedom reigned. The narrative of the American Revolution frequently emphasizes the rallying cry of no taxation without representation. I teach that to my students every spring. And frequently covers the political debates surrounding parliamentary sovereignty. And while those elements were undeniably central to colonists' grievances, an understanding of the Revolutionary War requires a deeper examination of other significant factors. And among those, the relentless drive for westward expansion stands out as a critical catalyst. Today, we're going to talk about how the unique environment of the American frontier, particularly the early settlements beyond the Appalachian Mountains and what would eventually become the state of Tennessee, cultivated a distinct spirit of independence and directly contributed to the grievances articulated in the Declaration. The continuous push for westward expansion, fueled by economic ambition, a desire for self-determination, and the development of a unique frontier identity, fundamentally clashed with British imperial attempts to control and restrict colonial movement. And this inherent conflict became a profound driver for the American Revolution and a subsequent drafting of the Declaration of Independence. The early American frontier was more than a geographic boundary. It represented a dynamic process of societal expansion and transformation. In the immortal words of Frederick Jackson Turner, the frontier was a belt of territory sparsely occupied by Indian traders, hunters, miners, ranchmen, backwoodsmen, and adventurers of all sorts that formed the temporary boundary of an expanding society at the edge of settlement. This environment fostered a perennial rebirth that profoundly shaped American character, emphasizing values such as equality, democracy, optimism, individualism, and self-reliance. It was characterized as a democratic, self-sufficing, primitive agricultural society where sacrifice and toil were common. This unique frontier environment served as a formative ground for the very ideals that would underpin the revolution. The conditions on the frontier, demanding self-sufficiency, collective action for survival, encouraged colonists to develop practical skills in governance and defense outside of established colonial or imperial structures. And this gets to one of the key things I want you all to remember today. One of the things that you're going to get out of this talk, one of the parts of the lecture today that I think are going to make it worthwhile for you to turn out on a Saturday. And that is the people that moved to this region got into trouble. And one of the things that got them into trouble was that there were people who claimed ownership over the region that we're living in. You all know one of these groups of people, right? The Cherokee. This was known as Cherokee country. There are maps made by British imperial surveyors listing this as Cherokee country. And some people will tell you, well, there weren't many Cherokee. They had died off by smallpox epidemics, experienced 80% population decline over the course of 1600s and 1700s. But they still claimed ownership over fishing waters. They still claimed ownership over hunting grounds. They still claimed ownership over burial mounds that had been there for centuries. You all know that. Some of you have seen some of these burial mounds in East Tennessee. And the people that moved across the Appalachian Mountains in the 1760s and came to what would be Tennessee got into trouble with Native Americans and wanted help. Wanted some sense of security in a wilderness that was perpetually insecure. Have you ever lived somewhere where you didn't feel safe? Have you ever had a home in an area that you felt like you might be killed on a daily, weekly, monthly basis? I haven't. Areas like that, I tend not to go into. I try to avoid them. I'm kind of risk averse. I'm not the person that would have crossed the Appalachian Mountains and been in this area. Okay? The people that were wanted help, wanted security, wanted some relief, wanted some protection. And those demands are there from the 1760s up to the American Revolution. When it starts, really the war starts in 75, and then we get the Declaration of Independence in 76. Okay? They're there for over a decade. And they're calling for help from North Carolina, the North Carolina colonial government. They're calling for help from the Virginia colonial government. They're calling for help from Parliament and the British government. And when no one responds, they reach out to the Spanish who are in Florida. And they reach out to Native American allies of the Spanish, like the Creek in our region. And they try anything to get anybody to listen to them. And this is their big rallying cry, friends. And this is what you need to pay close attention to. This is what shows up in our Declaration of Independence. It's this phrase, you all ready for it? Common defense. Have you heard that before? Common defense. Okay, and what that means is your neighbor, your fellow citizen, when they get into trouble, who protects them? You do. Now that's a hard sell, is it not? That's a hard sell. Because don't you want to tell people who move into these areas, look, you knew what you were getting into, bud, when you bought that house on that bad corner. Don't come crying for help, okay, now that you got yourself into trouble. That's what people are saying. That's what people are telling them. People in Virginia, even friends, people like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, are saying, you cross the Appalachian Mountains, you move into this area, which is essentially a war zone, friends, between roughly 1750 and 1800. It's roughly a war zone. Okay? You chose to do this. And the settlers on the frontier, men like John Sevier, are saying to men like Thomas Jefferson, there's a principle at stake, and that's common defense. There's going to come a day when you're going to want us to come east over the mountains. Don't sell us short. Don't tell us you're not going to help us, because we won't help you. And there's going to come a day when you're going to want our help. You're going to want men to come over the mountains. Some of you know your American Revolution history. You know exactly where I'm going with that. Right? The over mountain men, the Battle of Kings Mountain. Okay? All right? Battle of Kings Mountain does not happen without this shared sense of common defense. The people on the frontier, up and down the continent of North America, all along that frontier, that are in peril, that are in danger, their lives are forever at risk because they have chosen to carve out a life for themselves in areas that are controlled, owned, claimed, whatever you want to call it, by other people. Okay? And they're pushing. Settlers on the frontier, up and down the eastern seaboard, are pushing for this idea of common defense. You got to buy into it. You got to believe. If you don't, the frontiersmen will abandon you. Why should they help you when you don't help them? And they are able, friends, by 1776 to convince powerful men like Thomas Jefferson common defense is important. It's a principle, one of the principles that Americans stand on. And you think about our wars throughout American history. Whenever we have been invaded, whenever we have been attacked, the spirit in America that rises up during those moments is all about common defense. Even some of us aren't affected by it, right? It might be, I don't know how far it is from Knoxville to Pearl Harbor, okay? Thousands of miles away. We still feel it because we as Americans have ingrained that spirit of a common defense that started from settlers on the frontier in places like Knoxville and people like John Sevier. The Watauga settlement starts in 1770. The settlement starts in the 1760s. We aren't exactly sure when. Can you see that light yellow here? There aren't many great maps of the Watauga settlement. And I wanted to give you all a sense of the area that we're talking about. First settlers come in, roughly we guesstimate during the 1760s at some point, cross the Appalachian Mountains and settle in this part. And it's not until 1772 that Watauga settlers form their own government. They set forth a code of laws roughly modeled off of Virginia and North Carolina. They set up their own government there in what is today, around what is today Elizabethton. And this settlement lasts roughly 2 years. And Sevier and the other settlers in the Watauga settlement illegally rent the land there in 1772 from the Cherokee. They signed a 10-year lease. And what's interesting about that 10-year lease, there's a couple things. The Cherokee don't have a president. They're not one people that speak with one voice. You can't go to the CEO of the Cherokee and rent land from the CEO. It doesn't work that way. The Cherokee have many different groups within them, and if one group agrees to not kill you for a period of 10 years, the other groups are sitting around wondering, well, how'd that happen? And I don't necessarily agree with that. And within the Cherokee especially, there's an age gap between the older members of the Cherokee who are tired of fighting, they're worn down, they just want peace, they just want a retirement package, and the younger generation who would think the older generation is selling them. There's that complexity around this 10-year lease in 1772. But there's another complexity. And that's the fact that this area is west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay? And why this is illegal. The law of the land in 1772, we're all British. Parliament makes the law. The King of England makes the law. Okay? We aren't independent yet. So whose law are we supposed to adhere to when it comes to westward expansion, when it comes to going beyond the Appalachian Mountains? We're supposed to adhere to Parliament and King George III's proclamation in 1763. History teachers, history nerds in the room who are with me, is that ringing some bells?
No expansion west of the Alleghenies.
The Appalachians. Okay. The Appalachian Mountains are it seemed to King George III as a God-given natural boundary. The Appalachian Mountain Range, friends, actually extends north all the way. Newfoundland is a peak in the Appalachian Mountain Range. And it seemed to him that would be obvious to everybody, right? Something that you could say, you couldn't just say, well, I didn't know where it was on the map and I accidentally crossed the border and, well, didn't you see the mountain range? And in 1763, George III gives his proclamation, and there's a couple reasons for banning westward expansion, banning any settlement, any British settlement westward beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and reserving those lands for Native Americans. There's a couple reasons for it. The chief reason is that the British government went in debt fighting the First World War in human history. The 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, is the First World War in human history. It's the first conflict that's fought on numerous continents and numerous oceans across the globe. Great Britain wins, but they go deep, deep, deep into debt. 160 million pounds sterling, deep, deep into debt. And the French government goes into debt too, and both of them end up in revolutions at the end of the century because of that war debt, because they're trying to fight each other around the world. And one of the cost-saving measures George III believes in 1763 is if I ban settlers from going west, that's going to prevent that conflict, that trouble, right? Because I'm telling you all, that's the area you don't want to live in. That's the area you should not move to. Do not go out beyond this line and then call for help. Okay? He believes, George III, King of England, believes that this will be a cost-saving measure. We're in debt as a result of one war. We don't want multiple wars with Native Americans on the continent of North America that's going to get the British military 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean involved in another conflict. Okay? So we're banning it. That's why this lease in 1772, the Watonga settlement in East Tennessee, this is really interesting and really complex. And it has a lot of bearing on the Declaration of Independence. Okay? That's why it's illegal. It was illegal for the settlers to cross the Appalachian Mountains. Not only was it illegal for them to cross, it was illegal for them to live here and then to set up their own government and get a lease with the Cherokee to live here for a period of 10 years, which they then extend in 1775 by purchasing it. Okay? By purchasing it. Now, friends, just remember this from this talk in case you don't remember anything else. if you all are a group, and I go to one of you and I lease from you, the rest of you are going to go, well, where's my action? Okay? And then I buy from you, the rest of you are going to say, well, who elected you to do this? Okay? So from a Cherokee perspective, this is highly controversial. Highly controversial. And from a British perspective, okay, it's illegal. But from the settler perspective, this is the American dream. Land ownership in this beautiful country that seems to us to be sparsely populated. Okay, I look out around the Watauga River, I see some good fishing. I see some good places to live. All right. I don't know that you all have ancestors who are buried there, and I don't know that you all have claim to that area and are going to be angry about me settling there. Right? And for the settlers in the Watauga settlement, by establishing themselves in the first permanent settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, they're able to send a very powerful signal to men like Thomas Jefferson back east. They're able to send a very powerful signal. This is important. It's a principle that men are willing to fight for, that men are willing to die for. Okay? That's equally as important as this principle of common defense. It's part of the American dream here. So I want you all to remember that common defense comes from this experience of living on the frontier. And I want you all to remember that 1763 ban. That 1763 proclamation ends up in our Declaration of Independence. It's one of the causes of the American Revolution, that ban on westward settlement. There's actual wording in our Declaration that we're going to talk about that is explicitly about the 1763 proclamation. And the wording is interesting too, the way that Jefferson and the founders phrased it is interesting. Settlers don't stop. And the way I talk about this and get my students' minds around this is, don't raise your hands, but how many of you have been speeding on Route 40? Not just today, but ever. How many of you have ever gone past a posted speed line? Now there's a big sign right there telling you all this is how fast you should go. Okay? And some of you went faster, didn't you? The King of England bans westward expansion. Tells settlers don't cross the line. The Watauga settlers do. And so do people in what would become Nashville, Central Tennessee. Okay. There is another wave of 300 settlers in 1776 who are inspired by John Sevier and the Watauga settlers. Look, they did it. They crossed the line and they didn't die. They're still out there. They're making it work. And they're actually convincing people on the eastern seaboard that a common defense, military security is something that should be provided for. So they go to the Cumberland area. They form their own Cumberland Compact in 1780 that's based on the Watauga settlers' compact in 1772. Men like James Robertson. It's not just the settlers either. There's a great book on real estate development in colonial America, which is a sexy topic. I know you're all going to rush out and buy this man's book, but it's a great book and it's super, super important because Thomas Jefferson the lead author of the Declaration of Independence, George Washington, many folks who are on the eastern seaboard aren't just hearing from settlers. They aren't just getting letters about common defense, okay? Thomas Jefferson is a real estate developer. Did you know a lot of our founding fathers invested in real estate? Okay? And where do you get a lot of cheap land? Okay? The really expensive stuff is where people have been settled on for 150 years. Tough to get, really expensive. All right? You can get a lot of land cheap out on the frontier. Thing is, it's illegal. It's illegal, okay? Jefferson and Washington believed the 63 proclamation was a temporary thing. In their minds, they're thinking, all right, this is more of guidelines than an actual hard law that's going to be enforced in any way, shape, or form, right? So if we can get in on the ground floor of these Western lands, if we can purchase titles to them, and where do you purchase titles to? From places like North Carolina, places like Virginia, okay? You buy legal title to it, and listen, sometimes people get multiple legal titles to the same land. Did you all know that still happens in modern U.S.? My wife and I lived out in California for a time, and we put a bid in a house. Do you remember this lid? That other people had there were multiple people claiming ownership of it. It's like, who do you buy the house? It's crazy. Jefferson invested in Western lands. He's part of multiple real estate development companies that bought legal title to these lands, developed them, and was actively trying to sell them to settlers to get them to live there. Okay. And men like Thomas Jefferson are not happy with that 63 proclamation. Temporary or not, okay? They're very knowledgeable about that 1763 proclamation. It affects them, maybe not as much as John Spear and the Ottawa settlers, but it affects people back in the East. All right. At this point, I'm not even sure how far into this lecture we've gotten, but I wanted to drop some more knowledge on you. This is another thing I want you to remember today. Have you ever heard of the Quebec Act? Okay, you need to take my American Revolution class. I teach it every spring at the University of Minnesota. You all are familiar with Quebec and where this city is located in modern day Canada, right? It's a lovely city, I'm told. I would like to visit there one day. A lot of rich history in Quebec. Did you know that the Quebec Act in 1774 made the province of Quebec, not the city, the province, enormous? The largest province on planet Earth. Now, maybe some of you can't see this. I want you all to remember, I want you to tell people about this, go forth and tell others. Look how far south the province of Quebec was expanded. The Ohio River, if you can't see this on the map, friends, this is the Ohio River, okay? The Ohio River is deeply important to us here in Knoxville in this region. The Southwest Territory, you know its original name? The territory south of the Ohio River. That's us. We're here. Quebec extended that far south in 1774. Now, it did some other interesting things like guarantee religious tolerance to Catholics, okay, which is kind of interesting. I go to a Baptist church, West Hills Baptist Church, fantastic church. If you're looking for one, great choir. Baptists and Methodists do a lot of work around the American Revolution to argue that the Church of England is a lot like the Catholic Church, and we need to resist it at all costs. And so the 1774 Quebec Act giving rights to Catholics in North America rubs a lot of Protestants the wrong way. That's a whole religious history, and that's part two of this discussion. Yeah, maybe something for the question and answer period after. But it takes up a lot of this land that real estate developers like Thomas Jefferson are trying to buy legal title to. So you've got the 63 proclamation to deal with, is it going to be temporary or not? And then you've got the province of Quebec in 74 that's gigantic, that extends as far south to the Ohio River, and you're thinking, well, if you're a land speculator, if you're a real estate developer like Thomas Jefferson was, you're now thinking my risks have escalated. My odds of actually making money off of my investments in these Western lands is now shrinking. Okay? And you're thinking to yourself about what your rights are in that situation. Now I want to get you to the actual Declaration of Independence, and then we're going to take some questions, okay? There are different parts to the Declaration of Independence, and the largest part is a list of grievances. If you've never seen the Declaration of Independence, the middle part gets kind of boring. My students, their eyes kind of glaze over when we get to it. I have to tell them, this is the meat, where it will tell you exactly what caused the American Revolution. What did Americans care about, and why are they willing to fight and die for it? This is the meat of it. The beginning is flowery, and it's meant for the world. It's meant to convince people to create alliances with us. The end is our formal, where we stand up and declare independence. But the middle is all of the grievances, all the justifications. And there's several key grievances listed in the Declaration that directly reference the frontier. There's a charge that King George III has endeavored to prevent the population of these states by obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. Let me say that again. King George III has endeavored to prevent the population of these states by obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. That sounds topical. Citizenship, naturalization of foreigners, sounds like something we should all study the history of right now in 2025. It's in our Declaration of Independence. And do you know what they're talking about? Do you know what Jefferson and the Founding Fathers are talking about here in the Declaration? They're talking about the 1763 Proclamation. Okay, let me hit that again. King George III has endeavored to prevent the population of these states by obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners. By refusing to pass laws encouraging migration to North America, and by making it harder for settlers to acquire new lands. Isn't that an interesting way to hit the 1763 Proclamation line? Okay? It's about population. If you take the frontier away from us, fewer people are going to want to migrate from overseas to live here. Now, they leave that open for you to draw your conclusions that this is going to hurt real estate development. Okay? That's how they package it. Then there's a grievance listed in the Declaration that King George III was, quote unquote, enlarging the boundaries of Quebec. I would say so. I would say that's an enlargement. It's a direct reference in the Declaration to the Quebec Act of 1774, extending Quebec's boundaries in the western lands in the Ohio Valley, and directly influenced who could settle on the frontier. And then there's that phrase, common defense, that we see in our own declaration. I want you to remember, friends, the area that we lived in and that we live in now, and the people who lived here during the 1760s and 1770s, their lives, their experiences, their struggles, their ways of dealing with their struggles, those experiences made it into the Declaration of Independence, even though they're not in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress. Thank you for your time, and I'll take your questions. Yeah.
So when the settlers were going across the mountains and illegally renting, were they presenting themselves as backed by the British government, or did they come in and say, no, we're independents and we're, look, I just have to hold hard cash. I want the land.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you go with your hat in hand, you have to present yourself in a lot of different ways. And they're trying to get help from the British military and presenting themselves as loyal subjects, expanding the empire. They're trying to get help from colonial governments and presenting themselves as loyal Virginians, loyal North Carolinians. But they're also going to the Spanish. And presenting this as a good business deal. We've got an established settlement ready to go. All we need is someone to protect us. So they're presenting themselves differently to whoever they're asking for help.
Because I guess I'm just, and excuse my ignorance, but when we're talking about land titles in this period of time,
Yeah.
I think about land title day, you sign things, you get notarized, it
Yes.
goes to the clerk's office.
Yes.
How do these land titles even exist?
The colonial governments.
So the colonial governments have them,
And
even if you're on this side of the mountains.
Yep. And that's because the colonial governments are made up of land speculators. Okay. Real estate development really is big business. We don't think about the founding fathers as real estate developers. We think of them as lawyers if we think of them having any occupation at all. We won't even think about George Washington being a land surveyor. But real estate development is big business. And your expectation in buying that land is that along with your legal title comes some military support. It could be the Virginia militia. It could be the British regulars, even the Spanish military, or their allies, the Creeks. That's the expectation, or hope, if that, if you will. Yeah.
Well, that, to her point with, them registering deeds, that was part of the reason why later North Carolina was so willing to give up the land that they had west of the mountains, because it was so hard to administer. So being that if somebody had settled around Nashville and you had to go all the way back across the mountains to the government in Raleigh, the government was in Raleigh, but in all the way to almost coastal North Carolina to do business, it made it very hard, even just this side of the mountains, for them to do business. So that's why it was a good deal for North Carolina to just basically be like, hey, why don't you take this off of our hands? And, it solved the problem for them to not have to oversee a relatively troublesome part of their state.
And the period that Dave's talking about in the 1790s, I mean, it's then that we get people like Andrew Jackson saying in the 1790s, look, if the United States government is not going to help the people in this region, we'll go to the Spanish. That was a real possibility. That wasn't like pie in the sky. Hey, Andrew Jackson informed the United States government, you either help us or we'll get the Spanish to do it. Yes, sir.
Professor, kind of tying into that, and maybe you can tell me if I'm all wrong, I seem to remember from school days that part of the reason for the formation of Tennessee was that the governor of the Carolina Territory instituted a tax on all the people. And the people west of the mountains said no. So he sent the militia up to somewhere in Mountain City. There was a skirmish. They went back to Raleigh and said, you don't want anything over there.
That's interesting. I haven't heard about like a whiskey rebellion kind of tax resistance.
And that's one of the reasons the state constitution of Tennessee says there'll be no income tax.
The interesting thing about that, one of the questions I would have is, you know, Dave's right that North Carolina gives up legal control over this to the United States government. It's federal land in 1790 and thereafter. This is a Southwest territory. Knoxville is the capital. William Blount is the governor. And that's an interesting story how he got to be governor. But North Carolina doesn't have the legal leg to stand on to tax anybody after 1790 living out here. So you got 6 years between 1790 and 1796 where you're not paying tax to the North Carolina government. Yeah.
I just seem to remember that from elementary days.
Well, and maybe, God bless your elementary school teacher, maybe she was right and found some information that I hadn't heard of, that the North Carolina governor was trying to tax people out here in 1796.
It makes a good story.
Be an interesting power play. It sure would.
Where'd you grow up?
Here in Knoxville.
Oh, no.
Yes, sir.
This is a very practical question. The people came with ox carts, right?
All different. So it's a mixed group of settlers. It's not one group of farmers that would have oxen and be wealthy enough to buy plow animals. They're debtors. They're slaves. They're kind of worried about that. North Carolina, Virginia are kind of worried about, you know, what happens when you get a settlement out beyond the Appalachian Mountains that includes a diverse group of people. But there's some for sure that can travel that way.
Flatboats.
Yeah. What were you thinking with oxen in particular?
Well, I know my family didn't come till 1840, and there were two wagons. They had two wagons of ox cart full of things coming over from Clayton and near Highlands.
Yeah.
They came here to found a school in Sevier County, and the legend is there were two ox carts full of stuff they brought. And so I just thought everybody came that way.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I wonder if I can go back to my map.
Well, we don't get an all-weather road here until 1795.
Yeah.
Between Nashville and us to Abingdon, you know, an all-weather, all year-round road we don't get until 1795.
Yeah, and that's why I was going to bring up this map, Dave, to talk about the rivers. So the rivers are so important in our region for this very reason, that there aren't a lot of established roads. There are Native American pathways that have been in the Appalachian Mountains for centuries, and the Watauga settlers are crossing those Native American pathways and then using the rivers to their advantage. And the Cumberland River is why Nashville is where Nashville is. The Cumberland settlement only survives because of supplies from the Northeast as far as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's where they're getting their food and supplies from, down the river into the middle part of
John Roberts and do they call it the Donaldson Flotilla or something?
Yeah,
they came to Nashville by the river, on the river.
Had to run the gauntlet at what's now Chattanooga.
Yeah.
They were shot at as they were going by.
Yeah, I think about that. You know, I was in the Boy Scouts and I got my canoeing merit badge, and I've done a lot of canoeing. And I think about how hard it would have been to take a lot of supplies and think about moving somewhere permanently. You know, not just a weekend camping trip.
What was the political organization of the Watauga? group economy.
Yeah, it's modeled off of Virginia and North Carolina. They both had colonial legislatures. They both had elected representatives, and it's that election part of it that's seen as being democratic. Okay. It's democratic in the sense that you can elect representatives, people who will hold office and vote for you. It's not democratic in the sense that women could vote in the Watauga settlement. It's not democratic in the sense that Native Americans, African Americans could vote in the Watauga settlement. It's the representation and the ability to vote.
Would you go back to the slide that showed the extent of the Watauga Association? Yeah, that one.
It's a bad slide, I'm sorry about it.
Well, I didn't realize it was that extensive. I grew up in Elizabethton, and, you know, I know where they established the company, but I didn't realize that it was that extensive.
Yep, that 1772 10-year lease, and then the 1775 purchase is of that land. Now, we talked before about the complexities of that. Are you actually leasing it from the Cherokee? Are you actually buying it? It's a complex thing, but that's the region that they
Is that what they
leased
call
and then
the
purchased.
Transylvania Purchase?
That's a good
Do
question.
you not know that?
That's a good.
I don't
No,
think
I
that,
do. I do, but I don't. Yeah, I don't think it is. But you check me on that.
Chris, the yellow line there, is that the Eastern Continental Divide, is that the?
No, that's passing. With actuals.
That's a good question.
Well, it might have been the ballot, no?
You're talking about these yellow lines here, sir?
Yeah.
The one on your right, yes.
Yeah.
Because the Quebec one came all the way after something.
It could. Yeah, could be. It could be.
Dr. Magra?
Yeah.
So I just looked up the Transylvania colony, and it looks like it's mostly north of the Tennessee-Kentucky line. A little bit of it dips down into Tennessee, but it's a little bit further west.
So,
Thank you, Rose.
How's the Watauga in the state of Franklin?
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is about the state of Franklin, which is we could spend a whole other hour talking about the state of Franklin, which comes later on, and so that's why I didn't mention it now, because yeah, it's roughly 1784 to 1788, and comes after the Declaration of Independence. And today's talk was all about the Declaration
I
of
just
Independence.
couldn't remember when the time.
But that Watauga settlement and John Severe's experience setting that thing up and getting support for it absolutely plays a role later on in the state of Franklin and John Severe trying to get Franklin established. And you should all remember this area, like Knoxville's named Knoxville because the Secretary of War, his last name, Knox.
just behind you there on the wall.
You should remember that. Okay.
It's fine.
You should. Okay. You should remember that there's a Washington district because of George Washington, and there's a state of Franklin because of Ben Franklin. That these naming the process of naming, people think gives them some credibility, some legitimacy, and gives you a leg up when you ask for support.
Just like naming it the Marrow District for Spanish Governor Marrow.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, which a lot of people don't even know.
Mhm.
Central Tennessee was the Magra District, named after a Spanish governor.
So, one other question, so you talking about the speculators, is that one reason why there are so many of the frontiermen surveyors? Was that surveying for these speculators?
Yeah, that's a good question, Aaron, because surveying is a military exercise. we don't understand that today. We hire a surveyor to survey the boundary lines of our property if our neighbors are planting a tree too close. The United States military doesn't turn out for that. The National Guard doesn't turn out for that, okay? But if you want to go across the Appalachian Mountains into Cherokee country and survey it, you need military support to do that. And a lot of those surveyors, like George Washington, become military men after the fact. Robinson's a surveyor, okay? Sevier does some surveying too. People wear multiple hats, and that's another thing you gotta remember, is that John Sevier's not just a settler. If you put him in a box and you say, well, he's a frontiersman, he's a backcountry, whatever, that takes him out of his business world where he's a surveyor, he's a land speculator, okay? He's wearing multiple hats at the same time, the way a lot of folks are. Yeah.
Did the Watauga Association just go away after the revolution?
It did, yeah. It lasts roughly from 1772 to 1774, and the American Revolution kind of takes that energy, and men like John Sevier side with the American cause in the hopes that, well, we're gonna get rid of the 63 line, whether it's temporary or not, it's not gonna matter, okay? And we're gonna set up our own American government, and they're gonna provide us with the military support. That's why, after the American Revolution, people in our region are die-hard Federalists. Because we're banking on the federal government providing us with military support. And what Washington does is he throws a lot of the United States military support to the Northwest Territory. Instead of Southwest Territory, you guys are on your own, because Washington's afraid of Spain.
Was there anything formal done at that point, or did it just,
Formal with what? Sorry?
as far as disbanding Watauga Association? A treaty, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, no. That association survives through the revolution. They act as a group, but they're no longer trying to. Their goals are completely different. They shift as a result of the American Revolution.
I presume the Cherokee didn't give them their money back?
No.
I'm just curious what happened to Uber Quebec.
Uber Quebec is a good way of phrasing it. Yeah. So the United States government gets legal title to all of that land. And at the start of the American Revolution, we invade. We tried. Benedict Arnold even leads an expedition. It fails miserably because Canada, like Russia, has a pretty tough winter. But yeah, we try to take Quebec.
But it didn't have any lasting impact culturally or on society.
No, it's interesting how borders shift as a result of wars, and the 1783 peace kind of gives the United States Congress legal title to all that. And then it's a matter of, if you're a coureur de bois, a French fur trapper in that region, saying, well, now I guess I'm an American.
Yeah.
And I guess my new legal jurisdiction is the Northwest Territory. So maybe I'll join the United States military, who's now waging war against indigenous peoples in the Northwest Territory.
Yeah. Do you think, I read an article about Smithsonian, someone at Smithsonian said that the American experience with the British Army during the French and Indian War changed the attitude of Americans.
Yeah.
That they could be an independent people way before. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, that comes from Fred Anderson's scholarship, and boy, I encourage you to read anything Fred Anderson wrote, one of the greatest American historians. And that's his argument. A lot of military historians will tell you we didn't have a military at the start of the American Revolutionary War. We're going to war with one of the most powerful militaries with a bunch of farmers and pitchforks.
Mm-hmm.
And Anderson says, well, no, if you look at the men who signed up and fought, at the start of the American Revolutionary War, a lot of those are veterans of the 7 Years' War, of the French and Indian War. So it's not like we had nothing. It's not like we're starting from zero. You're starting with a lot of veterans who have wartime experience in the First World War.
Yeah. Doesn't he say that the British were about 4 to 2 inches shorter? They were so poorly fed compared to the Americans who had been eating beef.
Yeah, well,
For 2
well
generations.
listen, there's some propaganda there because we're both foraging. The Americans and the Brits are both foraging left and right throughout the 8 years of the Revolutionary War. And also, there's an interesting, I talked with my American Revolution students about this. There's a lot of pie in the sky idealism at the start of the American Revolution. And from when Congress authorizes the formation of an American army in June of 75 to the actual start date. This is an issue I have with birth dates. Because we're seeing all over, people are like, 250th anniversary of the American military. It's like, well, dude, look at the American Revolutionary War, all right? Congress authorized it in 75, but it doesn't start until January 1, 1776. Should be the real birth date of the American Army. and from June 75 to January 76, they're hammering out things like uniforms, things like flags, all right? They're hammering out things like rules and regulations, who's going to be officers in this thing. And one of the interesting initial, very pie-in-the-sky idealists, we're going to put together an American army for the first time. What's it going to look like? Their height requirements are 6 foot in the initial, which people aren't. There's not a lot of 6-footers, okay? And that's the thought being, well, we're going to have this big, impressive, a lot of esprit de corps in 75, like after 9/11, a lot of Americans want to fight. All right, we're no problem getting it tall. There's also a ban on swearing in the American Army, which George Washington is one of the worst offenders. Okay, there's all this pie in the sky stuff. So if you were to look at the height of the American soldiers in the Revolutionary War, you might see an initial and a decline as people realize, that initial patriotism, whatever you want to call it, that gets people out to fight in droves in 75 and 76, that all goes away once people start dying and once people realize, oh, this is a real war. This is not a fake thing, okay? The American Congress and George Washington had a tough time getting men to fight. And a lot of those restrictions, those regulations, they get changed real quick.
So, let me ask this question, since this time frame and birthday. So, the Army's was just the 14th.
I know it.
So.
You're gonna ask me about the Navy's in October?
The Navy's in October.
Yeah, I know.
And then
But do you know what
Marines-
that day?
And the Marines are in
Now
November
you're getting me
15th.
fired up here.
Yeah.
We're on YouTube, and this thing's gonna explode on YouTube, but dang, I mean, the American Army shouldn't have it, and
And you
the
know, I should
American
ask
Navy,
that question.
because October, the actual birth date, what they're celebrating, is the Marine Committee forming in Congress. Is that a Navy?
Well, of course it is.
Okay, all right, well, there you go. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is, the fighting techniques of the backwoodsmen, the British were used to marching out to engage the enemy. And the men who went over the mountain to fight the British, they were behind every tree, and it was a different style of warfare.
Yes, ma'am. Now, there's a grain of truth to that. There is an element of guerrilla warfare, asymmetrical warfare in the Revolutionary War. There's a grain of truth to that.
Well,
No.
Cornwallis, that particular battle.
Yes, ma'am, King's Mountain. There's a grain of truth to that. Most of the warfare in the 8 years of war, 75 to 83, most of it is line-on-line traditional European style warfare. Most of that, the fighting is driven by military technology. The Brown Bess musket is one of the most inaccurate but cheapest and mass-produced firearms on earth. You have to have line-on-line fighting. And even at Kings Mountain, the determining factor is not guerrilla warfare. I would argue it's the fact that those Over Mountain men are carrying fowling pieces that have rifling inside the chamber. That gives them a distinct advantage over the 1,000 loyalists who are there at Kings Mountain, who are using smoothbore Brown Bess muskets that are nowhere near the accuracy, nor have they trained with them to the extent that someone who's given a family heirloom, that rifling is expensive, it's handcrafted. The Over Mountain men are you know, it's interesting, I heard this about David and Goliath too, that David was like a trained assassin. And using that rock, and that he was trained to do it and was highly accurate and could take Goliath down, no problem. The Over Mountain men are using highly accurate fowling pieces that they've been hunting squirrels with for decades.
Well, that's what I was gonna say, they were used to having to go out and hunt animals for their food.
Yeah.
And in the woods.
Yeah, and I think that at Kings Mountain is a determining factor rather than, because the loyalists have the height advantage. They're at the top of the hill firing down. I mean, it almost doesn't matter what tactics you use, but the firearms, I think, makes all the difference. Thank you all.